December 1884. They gave the widow the icehouse to live in, and they meant it as a death sentence. 30 days a widow, no money, no claim, no one to speak for her, and the coldest month northern Minnesota had seen in a generation already closing the roads. Let her freeze in the icehouse, they laughed. They did not understand what an icehouse is built to do. By the end of January, every soul for 12 miles who could still walk would be lined up at its door, and the men who'd handed her a tomb would be the last ones she let inside. But in December, it was just a joke the town was telling itself. Her name was Marta Sundgren, 33. Her husband, Anders, had cut and stored ice on Spirit Lake for 9 winters, and in the spring, he'd gone through a soft patch with a full sledge and never come up. The lake gave back the horses. It kept him until the thaw. By autumn, his cousin Halvor had the deed to the lake lot, the team, and the good house, and what he had for Marta was the old ice house at the edge of the property, a squat, double-walled box, half sunk in the ground, that hadn't held ice in 3 years. He told her she could winter there if she liked, and he said it the way a man says a thing he expects to be a kindness he'll never have to pay for. The town agreed it was generous. They said she wouldn't last to Candlemas. Marta did not argue. She thanked him, took the key, and walked down to look at the building everyone had already decided would kill her. And here is the thing none of them had thought through. An icehouse is not a cold building. An icehouse is an insulated building. Anders had built that one himself, the way they all were built. 2 full walls with a foot of sawdust packed tight between them, a double roof, a floor laid over a foot more sawdust, and 1 small, heavy door. All of it for a single purpose, to stop heat from moving, to keep summer out so the ice would last till August. But a wall that won't let heat in won't let heat out either. Insulation does not care which direction it's working. That box had been built to hold a temperature against the whole force of the season, and Marta had spent 9 years married to the man who built it. She knew exactly what it could do. She had simply never heard anyone ask it to do the opposite. So she did not pack to leave. She moved in, and she went to work. She swept 3 years of old sawdust and mouse nests out of the corners. She found the seams where the chinking had dried and fallen, and she packed them with rags and clay and more sawdust until a candle flame by the wall stopped leaning. She hung Anders's old canvas sledge tarp across the inside of the door as a second skin, with a flap she could lift and drop behind her. And in the center of the floor, on a bed of flat stones so the heat wouldn't find the sawdust beneath, she set a small sheet iron stove no bigger than a milk can, the one thing of her husband's Halvor hadn't thought worth taking. She tested it the first hard night with the door sealed and a single armful of split birch. By morning, the little stove had long burned out. The thermometer outside the door read 19 below. Inside, against the wall, it read 48 above. She sat with that number a long while. 48 degrees, on 1 armful of wood, in a building the whole county was waiting to find her frozen in. She understood then that she was not going to die that winter. She understood something else, too, though she kept it to herself, that a great many people who were not laughing at ice houses might. Because the cold that was coming did not care how big your fireplace was. It cared how fast the heat left the room. The town ran on open hearths and tall stoves in tall houses, beautiful and hungry and impossible to seal. A house like that on a still January night was a bucket with a hole in the bottom. You could pour fire into it all you liked, and by 4 in the morning, your breath would still fog over your own bed. Marta's neighbors had never once spent a night the way she now did, in a sealed box that gave nothing back to the dark. The deep cold came the 2nd week of January. 11 below, then 19. Then a morning the thermometers in town read 36 under 0, the coldest reading anyone living could remember, and the wind off the lake drove it past 50. The school teacher sent the children home at noon, and 3 of them lost toes on the walk. The Lindholm family burned a fence, a wagon, and 2 doors in 9 days. A hired man named Beck froze sitting up in a chair 4 feet from a stove that had eaten its last log at midnight. And down at the edge of the Sundgren place, a thin, steady thread of smoke rose from a building everyone had written off and did not waver. The Peterson girl saw it first. Sent out to find anything that would burn, she came back saying the Icehouse was smoking. Her father said the widow was burning the last of her sticks. Her mother said something truer. She said, "Nobody burns steady like that. Steady means she's not afraid of running out." They went on Epiphany morning, the whole shiverin' family, because they had nothing left to lose by going. Marta lifted the canvas flap and looked at the 4 of them, blue-lipped on her step, and she said, "Come in out of it," the way you'd say it to anyone, and she dropped the flap behind them. The Petersons stood in a sealed room off one milk can stove and felt the cold let go of their bones, and the mother put her face in her hands. Before I tell you who came to that door last, if a story like this is why you're still here, do one small thing for me. Tap subscribe so the next one finds you. Then let me finish. By the 10th of January, word had crossed 12 miles of frozen country. They came in 2s and 3s, the Lindholms, the schoolteacher and her mother, a trapper who'd walked since dawn. Marta took them in shifts. She kept the stove fed with thumb-thick sticks, because thumb-thick sticks were all that little box ever needed. And she sent each family home with hot stones wrapped in flannel and the same quiet set of instructions. Seal the smallest room you have. Stuff the walls. Stop the heat from leaving. You do not need more fire. You need to stop losing the fire you've got. She was teaching a county full of people the one thing her dead husband had built into a wall. And on the last morning of the freeze, 2 men came down the path who had no right to. Halvor's hands were wrapped in rags, the fingers under them gone the color of a plum. The big house with the big hearth had burned through everything that would catch, and gone cold around him anyway. Beside him stood the man from the town board, who'd signed off on giving her the Icehouse and called it charity. Neither of them could quite lift his eyes. Marta looked at the 2 of them for a long moment, long enough that the cold worked into the silence, long enough for all of it to come back. Let her freeze in the Icehouse. Then she lifted the canvas flap and stepped aside. They came into the warm dark. They didn't apologize, not really. Men like that rarely find the words. Halvor sat by the milk can stove he'd left behind as worthless and stared at the packed sawdust walls like a man being shown a sum he'd gotten wrong his whole life. When he finally rose to go, he stopped at the door with his back to her and said only that he'd send wood in the spring. Marta said nothing. She'd stopped needing him to mean it. A newspaper man came up from St. Paul in February and sat on a crate in that Icehouse and wrote the line that followed her the rest of her life. The widow who outlived the winter in a box built for ice. The county recorder read it and heard from every family she'd thawed and recognized her right to the lake lot under the old common law. Halvor was advised, by men he could not refuse, to let it stand. Marta Sundgren wintered in that Icehouse 3 more years by choice, because it was the warmest room she'd ever owned. And then she built a small, tight house with the lake money, double walls, sawdust packed between them, 1 small stove. People came from 2 counties to see why a widow built her house like an Icehouse. She told them what Anders had built into a wall without ever quite saying it out loud. A thing that keeps the heat out will keep the heat in. It was never the cold that killed people up there. It was how fast they let the warmth go. If you've ever been handed what someone meant as your grave and turned it into the one warm place for miles, tell me about it in the comments. And to keep getting these frontier survival stories every week, tap the red subscribe button right below this video.